So you either just got a camera or are thinking about picking one up. And before you shoot your first video, you want to learn the basics. Luckily for you, by the end of this video, you should have a strong understanding of how to create professional and cinematic looking videos. So the most important thing to understand when you're first trying out is something called the exposure triangle. Think about it like pizza. There's the pizza dough, which is the aperture. There's the pizza's tomato sauce, which is the shutter speed. And there's, of course, the pizza's cheese, which is the ISO. All of these combine to make one beautiful composition. And there are many more little toppings you can add to this pizza to make it even better. P.S. Exposure basically just means how much light is hitting your camera's sensor. So if it's overexposed, that means that the image is too bright, and if it's underexposed, the image is too dark. So now you may be wondering, how do the elements of the exposure triangle actually work? So first, aperture literally means an opening, and that's exactly what it is. Essentially, it's the opening in your lens that controls how much light gets into your camera. So the wider this opening is, the more light can be let into the camera and creates a brighter image. Being able to control aperture is also great because it actually creates this blurry background cinematic effect that many Hollywood films use. To do this, you just have to open the aperture to as wide as possible or the lowest f-stop. This will create something called bokeh. So just remember, the lower the f-stop, the wider the aperture, and the brighter the image will be. So actionable step number 1, grab your camera, or you can check out the link in my description, which is for a camera simulator. Essentially, all you should do is go into manual mode and play with the aperture and see how it affects the background of the image and its depth of field, as well as the brightness. Number 2, the shutter speed. Shutter speed essentially has its definition in its name. Essentially what it is it's the speed at which the shutter closes on your lens. All you really have to know is when the shutter speed is slower, more light will be let in. And also just a note, shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second. For example, if I had a 1/50th of a second shutter speed versus a 1/250th of a shutter speed, the 1/50th will be much brighter. Shutter speed also lets us control how much camera blur we get, which is essentially the motion blur that we get. So as you can see when I wave my hand here, there is motion blur because I am shooting at a relatively low shutter speed. So if you make your shutter speed much faster, there will be much less camera blur, which can be a good and bad thing depending on your desired look. In terms of making cinematic video, having a lower shutter speed is a lot more realistic and makes it look a lot more professional because of that. So try not to bump up your shutter speed too much, just so you don't have that unrealistic looking film. Pro tip, just a general rule of thumb, is that you always want to keep your shutter speed roughly double your frame rate. We'll go over what frame rate is in a second. For example, if I was shooting at 24 frames per second, I'd want to technically be shooting at the shutter speed of 1/48th of a second, or generally on most cameras that would look more like 1/50th of a second. Actionable step number 2, go to your camera or go to the simulator I've linked in the description, play around with the aperture and with the shutter speed and see how that affects brightness, background blur, and motion blur. Number 3, ISO. So essentially ISO is your camera sensor's light sensitivity. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive your camera's sensor will be. This is technically an artificial method of increasing your exposure, so I tend to recommend not to put it too high, because when you do put ISO extremely high, you start to get noisy footage, which is never what you want. Noise is those little dots that you see around, and it looks a lot less clean of a shot, unless that's your desired look. Actionable step number 3, go to your camera or to the camera simulator and play around with all 3 of these and see how they all complement each other, affect brightness, affect noise, affect camera blur or motion blur, and also affect the depth of field or the blurriness of the background. Now, let's talk about frame rate. Frame rate is normally measured in frames per second, or FPS, and it refers to how many consecutive images are playing every second of the recording. So let's just go over the most commonly used frame rates. So number 1 is 24 frames per second. This frame rate allows you to get the most cinematic looking shots. This is because this is the standard frame rate that they've used in Hollywood films. This causes our eyes to perceive 24 frames per second as a commonly cinematic looking video. Next is 30 frames per second, and this one is a lot less cinematic looking. Essentially, you'll find 30 frame per second recordings in things like soap operas, news on your TV, and also it's the native frame rate of iPhones. So when you do record in this frame rate, people often perceive it as a much more homemade looking film, which causes it to look a lot less cinematic. So of course it always depends what you're looking for, and rules are meant to be broken, so that's just a general rule of thumb. Now let's get into 60 frames per second or higher. These shots are generally used for slow motion clips. So typically what people do is they'll record their videos in 60 frames per second or higher, like 120, 240 frames per second, etc. What they do is in post-production, they slow it down to 24 frames per second. So if you were recording at 60 frames per second, for example, and you slowed it down to 24 frames per second, that'd be slowing it down by a factor of 2.5. The reason to do this instead of just slowing down 24 frames per second clips is because let's say you were to slow down 24 frames per second by a factor of 2, that would mean that there's only 12 frames playing every second, and that would start to look extremely choppy and very unprofessional. You want to try to avoid that at all costs. Now let's get into image quality. So the industry standard in North America for image quality is 1080p. Essentially, this is the resolution, and it's 1920 by 1080 pixels. All you really have to know is the more pixels, the higher resolution. 4K is exactly double that at 3840 by 2160 pixels. That just creates a much higher quality looking video. And the reason you'd shoot in 1080 over 4K is only because you need that extra storage space, or your camera physically can't shoot at 4K. Generally though, I would recommend shooting in 4K. If you really need to save storage when you export on your computer, all you have to do is take your 4K recordings, downsample them to 1080p in post-production, and it'll still look much higher quality than 1080p, but just not as high quality as if you were to export it in 4K. So the most important takeaways from this video is lower aperture equals more exposure, lower shutter speed equals more exposure, and higher ISO means more exposure. And just a few other key takeaways. Remember, to achieve a blurry background, you want your aperture as far down as possible. Always try to keep your shutter speed exactly double the frame rate that you're recording in, and generally try to keep your ISO as low as possible just to avoid the noise that it produces to achieve the cleanest shots. Thank you so much for watching, and good luck on your next video.